I don't know whether I should just cringe, because, of course, with an introduction like that, where can you go except down? Or just be totally mesmerized by the most poetic introduction I have ever encountered, and of any speaker, may I say. Thank you. And I'm deeply grateful. Thank you so much, Marielle. I wish I could get a copy of that. Play it to my wife ad nauseum. She'll probably... My child will be least interested, but... Okay. Well, I should proceed fast because it's a slightly long paper, and I know that I don't want to keep you from the reception. So, but first, let me congratulate Leiden University for the establishment, for the founding of AMT, and thank in particular Professor Frank Piquet and Elena for organizing this over a long period of time. I keep reminding myself that it's not ATM, but AMT. And maybe we should all keep that in mind if you don't want to think of it as a place to get out some resources. Different types of resources here. But I am particularly delighted to be able to give this, and honored beyond belief, to give this inaugural talk, because Leiden is a very special place, and I have been coming here quite often for the last 5 years. What I see is a very difficult transition, but I think one that has been very successful from what is probably, as Frank pointed out, one of the best and oldest Humboldtian centers of education in Asian studies, having to transit to a neoliberal era where the meaning of research has changed. But I, for one, don't think it's hard, but there are many positive aspects to the transition as well. And I have actually been affiliated with several of your new organizations, or maybe not so new, but transitional organizations, such as I have been also with Chris in Merck. I believe I have some status there as a senior visiting fellow. I know on the advisory board of Philips IAS and the publication board. And now I'm very delighted to give this inaugural lecture. So it is, if I may say one more time, a great honor. So now let's move on and get to the topic, which is, which I have pictures for you. Well, lots of text too, but at least I won't read out the paper. There is a longer paper, and of course, I hope, which is, will be there on your website if it is not already, that gives the fuller paper. This is a bunch of papers I've been doing on these issues about the larger topic of which I want to write a book, but I don't have the time, is called Transcendence in a Secular World, the modernity and the non-Abrahamic traditions of Asia. But this is one part of it. Oh dear, okay. Okay, so the rise of Asia, I can see it here. Okay, good. The rise of Asia in China in particular is accompanied by the need, of course, that is felt among Asian intellectuals and Chinese intellectuals in particular for a new, more just vision of the world that is not simply a new hegemony, in other words, to start over from the history of globalization as we know it, as we've known it from certainly the 19th century onwards. Now, historically, universalisms have been the source of ideals and principles and ethics. I mean, usually when we just say universalism or cosmopolitanism, it doesn't make sense, but let's remember that every political, social system is founded on the basis of some ideals, and more or less they are ignored, but nonetheless, life cannot happen without some reference to them, right? And so they have been the source of personal ideals, collective ideals, and so on. But what we see, I think, interestingly, in the last 30 years or so, certainly with the decline of communism, is that modern universalisms have been in apparent retreat and yielding ultimately to nationalism and consumerism in particular. And yet, although we now laugh a little, unless we're personally religious, at the idea of salvation, it seems to me that the need for salvation is greater than ever before, and it is physical, right? We need to save the world from what we have been doing to it. It is much more urgent, it is needed more physically than metaphorically even, if that is a sustainable idea. Planetary sustainability is, I think, emerging in many quarters as the transcendent goal of our times, and that's what I'm going to try and explain. Now, at one level, you will see that this is certainly, and I'm not going to deny it, a prescriptive essay. It is an ethical advocacy. I am arguing for some version of transcendence as a sustainable goal. But I do believe it is also based on certain, as I said, emergent trends we're beginning to see politically, socially, and perhaps even economically, green capitalism and things like that, moving in that direction. And we need to be aware of this trend as it happens and and think of all the possibilities and dangers that it encounters. But immediately the effort in this presentation is to think through the conceptual and political framework for understanding the role of universalisms, particularly historical universalisms, which in my first bullet I bring up as something that the Asians are now trying to offer us, okay? So let's see how much it makes sense or not. Now, to review some of my older work, which I think many people have not read, luckily. The book on Manchukuo, which I spent the most time, is probably the least read. But it has to do with why universalisms in this particular moment, and not just the sort of metaphysical answer that I gave you about ideals. I think there's a political factor behind universalism as well. Because if you look at nation states from the 19th century onwards, especially from the late 19th century, when the whole globe began to be constituted by nation states, what we see is that while we call this period, or the 20th century, the era of nationalism, in fact, actually, it is very much a globalization, but it is a globalization through the nation state, right? Nation states, if you think of it, are a global form. Nation states are constituted by very modern global ingredients, right? And without these ingredients, you could not imagine a nation state. And yet the nation state sees itself as distinctive and unique, right? So that's the paradox that I'm trying to suggest. So nation states were themselves global products, but this globality, as it were, was misrecognized. And the ingredients that I talk about are simple things like electrical units, like the hertz and so on, which had to be common everywhere in order for you to to make it work as a modern entity. If you look at national anthems, if you look at national flags, they really look much closer to each other than the other logos of political communities at any other point in time. But much deeper things like the very concept of the child. This is one I always bring up. I am old enough to remember that in agricultural societies like China and India, to be a child meant to be 5 and under. The moment you crossed the age of 5, you were put into the fields. Not that I was, but anyway, one was put into the fields and you were an adult and dealt with as such. Now you look at every constitution in the world today, of any so-called nation state, you'll find that to be a child means to go on till the age of 18, right? There you go right away. You are constituted by very different cognitive principles. Well, similarly, what does it mean to be a criminal? Similarly, what does it mean to be normal? Similarly, as I have argued ad nauseum, what does it mean to have a history, a national history? All national histories are constituted by ancient, medieval, modern periods. And they have some kind of renaissance that joins the ancient to the modern. And it becomes a propulsive movement, right? So they're all very similar. So it's in that sense that it's a form of cognitive globalization, but not a recognized globalization, right? And so instead it is a misrecognized globalization. So why do we have to misrecognize it? Why do we say that, no, ours is the unique history, we are a unique nation and so on? Because, of course, sovereignty in the system of nation states is based on anarchy. There is no political system that can organize this whole thing. And it's designed for competition. The whole system is geared for competition. And the only way that you can exercise sovereignty is by claiming that this is your unique land, your unique people. Other people can't encroach in it. You create a formation and everything about it is unique, and you have a greater right to it than anybody else, and others don't. But I think in this day and age, in the era of recognized globalization after the Cold War, what we see is an even greater mismatch. And there are very interesting things going on in this period, but to put it very simply, this mismatch is greater because in some ways, every nation now depends more and more on resources from across the world. Wealth production, individual wealth production, all of the people's, the ability to have certain types of lives and so on, depends very much on resources from all over the world. And its extraction and its processing is also now globally diversified. So then, but your institutions of remediation, of justice, are national at best, right? And so there is a very fundamental mismatch. People who may be responsible for the greatest extraction or greatest pollution may be far away from where you bring them to justice, or where you can. So there is, it seems to me, a very major kind of, and this has been happening more and more with the idea of the transnationalization of the nation state itself, its withdrawal from public distribution functions, from notions of national legality and things like that. And there are very few authorizing structures to validate the reality of transnational society. And we see this in lots of, not just migrants, but workers across and so on. Anyway, that's not what we want to talk about today. So whether we talk about terrorism, biological or economic epidemics of the environment, or many other problems, we have reached a stage where we really need to transcend the nation state in certain very important ways and national interests, simply in order to continue to have the nation, right? Even if you still love the nation, to have it, you have to give up some parts of it, right? Some parts of that power. So, and one of the, projects I have done some work on, and which lots of people have worked on, is the problem of water in Asia, which is sort of really distills, as it were, that problem. If you look at, in Asia, the most important rivers, 10 most important rivers that flow across different countries are all in the Himalayan basin. And these now, of course, you have lots of developments. And it's not just China that is producing dams and diverting rivers. I mean, they have all upstream and downstream countries have this problem. India, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Laos, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. So all of these societies have, but one of the major problems, of course, the construction of dams across the Salween and the Mekong, and the idea of that because North China is drying out, there is this project to divert water from the southern rivers, from the Zhalong Yangpo and so on, and Yalong Sangpo, I mean, and this can cause a lot of problems, a lot of tensions between nuclear powers like India and China and Pakistan and so on. So, I mean, we're talking about very risky sort of developments that cannot be solved nationally, that need some kind of transnational authority. They can't be solved bilaterally either, because you need authorities that can go in and conduct analyses of water levels and this, that, and the other, that is quite independent, right? That's not dependent on local structures. So anyway, we go on here. Now, slightly thick description I have to do here, because this is a conception that I'm trying to develop, so I have to walk you through some of these. Don't worry, you don't have to read it all, I'll walk you through them. The way I think of transcendence, which has become a very important concept in my writing, is it draws actually originally from a school of thought that came out of a Weberian tradition of Karl Jaspers, and who wrote about axial age traditions from the 6th century BC. And there's a whole axial age school of thinking, which has now got many different traditions within it. But I actually take only one or two ideas from them and have adapted it to my own purposes. And by this, I mean, theirs is a whole civilizational narrative and mine is not. I think of it first and foremost, not even as an ontological position, but as an epistemic locus, a type of knowledge that exists in many societies. And a type of knowledge that becomes more or less powerful at different times in different societies, historically. I also think it's been one of the most underestimated historical forces that should be that has its role up there with economics and politics and so on. And that's one of the partner papers I'm writing on this. Now, if you wonder what's so exciting about transcendence, it is, first of all, it is an epistemic position. It is one which is a type of knowledge which can take a synoptic view of the world, right? And distinguishing it from, as Habermas says, the flood of phenomena and the flood of the everyday and the flood of projecting the present as it is into another world or into an abstract realm. So it must have the capacity for abstraction from the here and now. And it therefore then becomes the basis historically for universalisms. And it's typically been associated with empires and other large formations that once you get them, you have this ability to then also project and conceptualize outward. But that's not necessarily the case at all, and nor is it necessarily only associated with religion. The locus generates a kind of reflexivity of the self. Now, this is very important for my old friend who passed away recently, Eisenstadt, and people who see this as it produces a kind of an agentive capacity, right? You have, there's a kind of self-reflexivity. You try to understand your position in relation to the other world, in relation to society, and in order to then be able to transform and situate and become the source of ethics. So the locus has a powerful and underestimated role in history, generating, of course, the establishments all over the world. And this was the axial age theory, that whether you get Confucianism or you get Brahmanism or you get Buddhism or Taoism or Judaic thought or Christian thought, Islamic thought, all this is made possible from the idea of a separate locus of knowledge and authority, which is different from the political realm. And, but I think what is more important from a historical perspective is that it is also just as much counter-establishment. This is the same source of authority that can empower the prophets or the, the messiahs or people who, or they don't have to be revolutionary particularly. They can be just resistant, or they can operate at the level of changing the ethics of the self and so on. But they also have been historically very powerful. We see here the Franciscans, the Sufis, the Buddhists, the Jains, the Bhakti, Neo-Confucian Taoists, so on, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and so on. All of them have some kind of notion of an alternative source of authority. That is more or less sacralized, that is more or less rational. Now, this is one of the most important debates in the notion of transcendent authority. How much does it need a source of sacredness, and how much of rationality can be applied to it? And I think that, we are very used to, from the Abrahamic religions, of associating transcendence with the idea of God, with the idea of belief. But in the non-Abrahamic traditions of Asia, they are much more associated with what Weber calls the intellectual traditions of the East, the notion of Tien, for instance, of heaven, or of Nirvana, or of Brahman. These kinds of notions are just as much achievable through forms of devotion, bhakti, or forms, but more importantly, through techniques, technologies of the self, rational processes, cultivation practices. One of the most important concepts in Confucianism is Shushan, which is self-cultivation, these are the ways in which you can access and tap into the power, the ethical power, as well as sometimes magical power of the transcendent. So it is in this that I think that these are the kind of transcendent traditions that may be more meaningful to our world, actually, in some ways, rather than pure faith. But you can never separate out the idea of faith and belief from rational procedures. So you need both rational and sacred authority, even in relation to modern ethics, which derives very much from a disenchanted universalism. The transcendence in the modern era continues to be important, although it is often displaced and sanctions different values. Then I go on to look at modern universalism, because the argument I make here is very much that modern societies have also needed universalisms, but they have needed a special type of universalisms, and they have been inadequate in many ways, and in part that is why they're in retreat today. And by the way, because we need the notion of this kind of cosmopolitanism, and what I mean by cosmopolitanism, if I'm going to take my argument from universalism to cosmopolitanism, let me just give you briefly my definition from page 3. It is the idea that all humans belong non-exclusively to a single community. Thus, while this sense of belonging may be shared with other communities of identity, such as locality, nation, religion, the cosmopolitan community must be able to share sovereignty with any of these other communities of affinity. In other words, the institutions or representatives of the cosmopolitan community must be able to make sovereign decisions in some mutually agreed upon areas of political society. So, and as what I do in the paper is undertake a type of, a kind of understanding of Kantian universalism, which I believe is very much the basis of, is the ur-form of modern universalisms. And I think we can trace Hegel, Marx, many of these modern Western thinkers to this problematic of Kantian universalism. The interesting thing, what differentiates modern universalisms and Kantian universalisms from earlier archaic universalisms, religious universalisms typically, is that It is like those archaic universalisms, it is an Archimedean position also. It has to be from something outside the world. But this position then has also to be a non-partisan, right? It has to be objective. So, and that's why the religions took this Archimedean position, because if you were taking it from within the world, people would suspect you of being biased towards one way or the other, right? So, I mean, there's a doubling here that you need. And I think Kant was very obviously, a great thinker who defined his categorical imperative very carefully to be able to achieve that. So he says, I must act through the maxims by which one can will that they be universal, which is in some superficial way like the Christian maxim of don't do unto others or whatever it is, anyway, that you would do to yourself. But it's actually different and carefully worded because it's a negative statement. And by that I mean that, and this is argued by Honora O'Neill, who is a rationalist defender of Kant and wants to argue that it is a negative regulation. It prevents anyone from claiming any special privilege, so that it is both, it can be non-partial as well as non-transcendent. That is the thrust of her very important work on Kant. Then there are other Kantian interpreters, analysts, like Palmquist, who argues that religion is absolutely essential to Kant. Kant needs the idea of divine assistance, and if you look carefully, his, what is it called, the permanent peace and things like that are dependent very much upon the idea of a moral Christ, not necessarily a divine Christ, but a moral Christ that comes in, and divine assistance is necessary because faith fulfills a genuine need for reason. Now, what I did do was, I'm not, of course, a specialist on Western thought, philosophical thought, but I did try to look at a couple of essays in order to figure out how he tries to work in this idea of faith and reason, the relationship between faith and reason. And it's an essay that historians will enjoy reading because it reads quite well. And one of the things he says is this idea of a universal history, is that history is like the unstable weather, not fully predictable, but which maintains a uniform course of natural events. So long as humans act in the faith that this natural course will eventuate. So in other words, you have to know that this is going to happen, but it will only happen as long as you have the faith that it will happen. History will end in a civic union of the human race, otherwise you'll just be, So history has meaning in the end. And that's the important thing, it's in the end. So the transcendent God in this figuration is left out of the historical process. It is not a causal figure. It's not a causal actor. Unlike historic archaisms, right? Universalism, archaic universalisms, where, as Mircea Eliade has told us, religions trump history, the return of the eternal, right? And the eternal return and so on. Here, it does not intervene in history. But nature or providence, the idea of history, has a goal, has a telos, has a meaning in the end, right? And humans need to believe in this ultimate meaning in order to realize this utopian ideal of history. So I think this Kantian figuration really sums up the most modern universalisms. For instance, you have the utopian end of history in Hegel and Marx, and in modernization theory as well, which for a long time mistakenly felt that we should all become like the contemporary West of that time. And a transcendence, this is, for someone like Kant then, to put it sort of technically, transcendence is an ontological condition of God for him, of which we cannot know, or we cannot speak. Just like the Tao says, the Tao of which you can speak is not the Tao. But what Kant does recognize is the transcendental, which is the a priori knowledge by which we can know that there is something beyond, right? The factor that allows us to know. So it is really the transcendental is the epistemological condition of knowing the limiting boundary of your world and what is not in your world. Now, to translate this into a sort of more immediate practical context, I want you to look at a very modern phenomenon, like the Great Leap Forward in China, right? 1958 to 1960. We just had a joke about the Great Leap Forward. But the Great Leap Forward was built, of course, on, as so many communist plans, whether it's 5-year plans or longer plans and so on. It's built very much upon rational ideas of how an economy is organized, how society is organized. It's a social science, right? It's a Marxist social science or a Maoist social science based on the idea of a science. But if you look at the Great Leap Forward, so much of it is based on this idea of faith, right? Which is why you need this heavy ideological persuasions, the campaigning and all of this stuff, which where to bridge that promise of the future, that ultimately you have to make that leap into the promise of the future, right? And so this is always the case with ideas of modernity. So to some extent that transcendence, and perhaps you don't want to call it transcendence at that time, but it is in many respects like it, is pushed to the end, is located in historical time, but at the end of historical time, so that it is in that sense beyond history. How am I doing? Not very well. Okay. So problem with modern universalism is that it fears the sacrality that such faith requires and cannot invest deep emotion in the symbolism of the goals. And so this is the aporia of modern universalism, that they both have to deny sacrality for good reason. We know that sacralisms also produce a lot of problems in favor of rationality, but they need both. In part, you cannot work without the symbology of the transcendent, of the promise, the goal that is there, right? You have some pictures of Chiyuan asking of heaven as a transcendent force. These are, of course, modern pictures, but it's very interesting to see this modern depictions of heaven. Then we come to the case of Chinese conceptions of trying to work with historical universalisms. Many of you have heard of someone like Chao Ting-yang, who has a model of Tianxia as the new world order, that there should be a Chinese-dominated world order in which will draw upon the old Chinese ideals of everything under heaven, which is a kind of a feudal order, but of decentralized institutional process where people work according to ritual roles, and the state keeps this order going and so on. Well, I don't have much time to talk about this, but to summarize it briefly, I don't think that, I think he's wrong in the way he depicts this harmonious order, certainly for the period after the emergence of the Qin imperial state, the Qin Han imperial state, when increasingly the Tianxia becomes an ideology of the state, a part of the hegemony of the state, and very much subordinated to the needs of the state rather than an order-maintaining system. But at the same time, I do believe that it is very important to understand the role of Tian, or heaven, in Chinese cosmologies, that this is something which is a source of many things, but of personal self-formation. This became very clear to me when I was studying some redemptive societies in the regions of Manchukuo and Dongbei in northeast China. But all over China, you have these religious societies, quasi-religious societies, who engage in a lot of efforts to develop a sense of their own self and their self-cultivation through the techniques of what it means to cultivate the self from heaven, a heaven-given sort of idea, much like the emperor is the son of heaven, and so on. Now, it is true that the So Tian and Tao remain very powerful sources of spiritual and bodily empowerment for Taoist, Confucians, syncretic societies, redemptive societies, even as Tianxia becomes a state ideology, it's also a very important source of self-formation. And I think we can see through many of these people that their commitment to personal transformation, social transformation, political transformations are derived very much from this tradition, long tradition of self-cultivation in Chinese thought, which we can find in, of course, many other yogic traditions in India and so on, the whole sets of schools of thought as well. I wanted to show you this picture of the Tiantan, or the Temple of Heaven, because more than anything else, to suggest that, you know, the Chinese emperor recognized very early the power of this enormous source of transcendence of heaven, and very much confined the worship of heaven to the emperor himself, and closed in this very closed circuit. Once in a while, they used to perform it open air in Taishan and places like that. But that became less and less available. And after 1080 AD, it never took place in the open air, precisely because then it has access to, then others may have access to it as well. Then I try to say that even modern secular ideologies have very strong need for notions of transcendence, but the notions of transcendence that nations utilize are, of course, highly limited notions of transcendence, because they are based on a tribalist concept of a self versus other, right? So it's a very limited form of transcendence. In what sense is it transcendence? Well, it's the imagined community. Transcend your relatives, transcend your neighborhood, transcend your regional tie, and so on, become unified under the nation. In that sense, it's a transcendence, but it's very different from a religious transcendence, which has much more universal goals. So here's a very good, this is the figure, manifest destiny is none other than providence, the same providence that Kant talks about. And you can see what manifest destiny allows you to do. You save yourselves, but then only by wiping out whoever else was there, right? Well, this is not just confined to the US. Look at this, the limited transcendence of nations, where you have this enormous Hindu symbolism and so on that goes back. What I really love is this Gandhi in the La Pieta mode, right, with his 3 bullet wounds held by Mother India in her flag and so on. It's in fact appealing to a Christian imagery. There's also a wonderful picture of Mao Zedong as he comes out of the Anyang coal mines and so on, dressed up, where he has been painted from a model of St. Paul, right? And it's very much the saintly figure that sort of emerges. I wanted to get a picture of that, but I didn't. But instead I got these, the limited transcendence. We all know that the worship of the children of Huang Yan, okay, I'll be able to do it, is very important in China. And this has been growing in importance. And recently you even had none other than Mao Zedong's daughter, Li Na, involved in the worship to the Emperor Yen. And as you can see, it's quite ritualized and quite fabulous in its whole aura. Okay, now let's get to sustainability. So can we feasibly, I'll be able to do it in 10 minutes. Can we feasibly elevate, you mean less, sustainability to a transcendent ideal? It seems to me that the 2 main obstacles are, of course, untrammeled capitalist consumerism, which doesn't allow us to, you know, do you always take a look and decide when you buy something whether A, you need it, and whether it's good for the environment? Well, it's something that will, I think, gradually and hopefully become part of cultivation of self, right? But so that's one. But the other very important thing is the political institutions, because nations, of course, national leaders are very nervous about alienating national development, whether in China, India, any of these Asian places and so on. And that's also a very major obstacle. So what is the way out? I think it's the slow, long way. It is, in fact, organizations of civil society, organizations of, and that are happening. And we need to look at how it's happening, in what ways it is forming, that work with certain kinds of transcendent sources of self that are relevant here. And we have here, there are lots of course, important movements coming out of organization, Earth First, etc. But one of the most interesting of these is this movement called deep ecology, which was started by a professor, no less, by the name of Gottlieb. But they've done a lot of stuff, and they have been much more actually instrumental in China than we realize. And the ways in which transnational civil societies have linked up with forms of civil society, environmental organizations in China is something that I want to give you a little glimpse of. And they've already started this process of secularizing nature. Now, I am, by the way, not talking about environmentalism. My goal is not necessarily environmental, it's sustainability, right? I mean, it's a different phenomenon, though it seeks to balance, or as the Chinese might say, harmonize some of these issues. So we need a universal goal for sustainability where nations have to share sovereignty on many of the issues. And how do we create the social basis of those kinds of things? I think it requires us to learn once more from historic universalisms, not only how to secularize nature, but much more important, and the paper has a lot more on this, on the methodology of how the self, the local ecology, and the universal can be linked. And I think we have these in many different Asian forms, Chinese, Indian forms of how these methodologies work. In the paper, I also talk a little bit about Tagore, who tried to implement this in Shantiniketan. And although he was ahead of his time there, but it's an interesting effort. And I think we have a lot of things going for it in China itself. I mean, of all developing societies, the Chinese government has been the most committed to the greening of the society and has put in a lot of resources in environmental, public education, the spread of NGOs, especially in places like Yunnan and so on, which have not necessarily conformed, of course, to the Chinese view of what a proper environmental education should be, but nonetheless have been able to thrive. And but one thing that we realize is that often Chinese environmental education and pedagogy is very limited, right? It's not important for your exams and for your career and so on. So you just do it like you do civics courses and so on. Secondly, these are urban people who have very little connections with nature. I mean, they're watching TV if they have to do anything, right? Or doing something with their fingers, right, on those things. But so some of the Yunnan NGOs have been very inventive, and what they have learned to do is something that may initially strike us as a little bit reactionary, but very interesting. They have tried to link it to ideas of homeland education, which was of course communicated in mid-century to the notion of Heimat and Kyodo in Japanese and Xiangtu in Chinese, this kind of education that now where children are taught about the plant species in their own localities and how to see spot a foreign plant, right, and things like that, or an invasive species or something, and go from there to sort of gradually build up the commitment, which I think does work with that kind of methodology. Here is an example of some of these Yunnan networks. I love that duck on the table. Then one of the last slides that I have is about the Chinese. One of the things I discovered recently, the greening of Chinese Taoism. What happened, the Chinese Taoist Association, for those of you who do China studies, will know that this was an association it was a pretty fake, weak kind of association, and much weaker. It's a government agency, and meant to look after all Taoist affairs. And it was much weaker than the Buddhist Association and things. But suddenly in 1995, this guy, Master Ren of Lo Huan Tai, had this inspiration that, you know, Taoism is about nature, it's about the environment, and he took it upon himself to do this. Well, within 5 years of his declaring this, what you get is all kinds of international NGOs begin to sort of circle around them. And there is this association called the Alliance, the NGO Alliance of Religions and Conservation, ARC, which declares itself a secular organization, but it's actually based in Bath in England, and its honorary president is Prince Philip. And, but the goal is to get religions all over the world to work on environmental issues, right? To sort of, as it were, retool themselves. And so these two forces came together, and the most amazing things have started to happen to this Chinese Taoist Association, which found a new role for itself, which found a new role for its transcendence, right? What it did was it declared that Lao Tzu is now the god of ecological protection. So he is Shanghai Pao Shen, that's the new name for Lao Tzu. And you know, they control a lot of Taoist temples all over. So when you go to worship, pilgrims go to worship, you can't burn more than 3 sticks of incense. You have to have sticks of incense. You have to have, so they have all these environmental audits in all the temples, including the big 5 temples and things like that, right? So water management, environmental education, and so on. So it's really interesting to see how it's been revived by this new sense of mission and transcendence and so on that is found. I may be exaggerating, but they've been doing a lot, and you know, I love their flag. Did you notice their flag? Look at that yin-yang flag of Taoism. It's totally naturalized with leaves and feathers and all of that, right? So what, now to talk more methodologically, what we need through this triple linkages and so on of the self to the universal via the locality, we need a symbolic mobilization as the process whereby the individual can convert his or her personal experience into the truth, right? Into some kind of perhaps even transcendent truth. This is what Foucault called, of course, in his later studies, the games of truth. And this is a kind of mobilization of self-cultivation practices and so on, that it seems to me that if the Tao Te Hui women were doing it and the Yikuan Tao were doing it in the 20th century, there's no reason why it cannot yet be recovered again, you know. And if it was meaningful for people then, why can't it be meaningful again? And, you know, and the Taoists have shown us how to make it meaningful, right? At least some ways. So we need to rethink also, of course, the very important relationship between sacrality and rationality. And I look at some thinkers like Paul Ricoeur and others on this, but we don't have time to go into it. But rationality must be built on figures of hope for planetary sustainability. So it's the figures of hope is the sacred dimension. And finally, it seems to be pretty clear that for individuals and social organizations and so on, they need to devote as much time and importance to planetary sustainability in education as they do to national history and national identity building. This is the challenge for the transcendent prophets of our time. So thank you. Sorry to go over.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions and comments.